of minutes. Why? Read every night. Read 20 minutes a night. So much easier. What happened? Your first entry on your log.
I'm waiting.
You didn't bring a pencil? Everybody want to slide yours over? I know it. All these people that are doing their first reading. A while ago. This is how you get good grades, by recording these free 20 minutes. You're going to forget about them, and then we'll Okay. Did I miss anybody? Okay.
14.
Anybody else? Last call for reading logs? Donovan, you got yours filled out? Okay, Peter, why don't you relocate over by Michael? Oh, did you? Oh, you're. I thought I was signing it, or did I already sign it? Oh. All right, just a couple of quick little reminders before we actually get into class. Okay, obviously today's the videotaping day that we discussed a while ago. I forgot to even bring it up yesterday. It's been just kind of going with flow. Forgot to remind you guys. So hopefully, did you get? How many of you got the text message? And oh yeah.
I did. Alex told me.
So you ready to smile pretty?
Yeah.
All right. Just a couple of requests. If time permits, we are going to do a little activity at the end with BYOT. So I also texted you to bring your device. So if you have it, you can have it sitting out, ready to go. If you don't, you can buddy up with somebody, okay? Because it's just a quick little Socrative thing. I'm going to ask that try your best to ignore the cameras, forget that they're here. Sitting in the middle of the tables, you see some little black bags. Okay, those have microphones, so try not to bump into them. Keep yourself away from them. You don't need to talk into it, it will pick you up. All right, so today we are going to have a little discussion about an article we're going to read. I'm going to read it out loud. We're going to discuss it as we go. But the topic is, the title of the article is called The Manhattan Project. Okay? Anybody have any clues what they think that might be about? Got a few people.
Wait, what's this one?
The Manhattan Project. Seth, what's your guess?
Maybe they're building something.
Okay, maybe they're building something in Manhattan. Does that sound like a logical conclusion? Manhattan? Yeah. What is Manhattan to you? What do you think of when you think of Manhattan?
New York.
Okay, so it's a borough in New York. And a project, so you thought, okay, that's a logical guess. Andrew? A trash pickup? Maybe. Okay. Drew?
I actually know what it is.
Oh, you think so, eh?
It's when they built the first atomic bomb.
What?
What?
You think so?
Yes.
Maybe. Peter, what do you think?
Yeah, same thing.
Okay, you agree with Drew? Okay.
No, they
Josh?
Oh, I was thinking about the traffic order. Maybe they're trying to control it.
Control traffic in New York. So if you've ever been to New York, maybe coming up with a way to avoid the congestion might be a good idea. Okay. All right. So some good ideas. It is, as Drew said, about the development of the first atomic bomb. Okay. So this is one of the bombs that we're going to talk about. The reason I picked this article, twofold. Okay. Right now we're in the middle of our atomic theory discussion. Okay. So you guys have learned a little bit about atomic theory. Think back to your timeline when you did your timeline activity. Do you remember how our understanding of atoms and what they represent has changed significantly since Democritus' days in the 400 BC to even the 1950s? It's changed quite a bit. So just another science word. It's called a theory, atomic theory. Why do you think it's called atomic theory and not atomic law or atomic fact? Why theory? Joshua?
It's not proved completely correct.
Okay, that's actually probably a pretty good explanation of the difference between like a theory and a law. You've heard of Newton's laws when you guys did science last year. You know, we call it Newton's laws, not Newton's theories. Okay, so again, the difference between a theory and a law is more that a theory is science community is pretty confident that this is the way things are, but they know it could change as we get more evidence. Okay, so we don't want to say it's thou shalt be, it's the law. You know, so Newton's laws. You know, we said all right, we have no doubt across the scientific community this is what it's going to be. And because you guys did that timeline, hopefully that explains to you why it was a theory. Okay, because it continued to change as more evidence and more technology was developed. You know, at one time they thought the atom was the smallest part. Then they learned that atoms were made up of protons, neutrons, and electrons, which are obviously smaller than the actual atom. Then they've learned that, well, those are made up of something called quarks, which we aren't even discussing in this class. And then they're going to find out what the quarks are made of. So they keep trying to find the smallest and smallest and smallest particle to kind of find out what is the building block for everything. So it's still kind of a theory. All right, so the Manhattan Project will tie into our atomic theory discussion. In history right now, you guys you're in the anti-slavery movement area, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so you're in the Civil War era. So probably, I'm going to guess by around Christmas, maybe right after winter break, you'll be getting into World War II, okay, which is this era. This is when the atomic bomb was kind of out. Okay, so I'm going to pass out the article we're going to read. I'm going to read it out loud. I'm going to ask you guys to follow along. I'm going to put up some things to consider, just kind of have in the back of your mind as we're reading it, that if you want to use a highlighter or a pen to kind of write on your copy to kind of put little notes as to where you think there might be some important information to go back to, that's perfectly fine. Okay. So I'm going to put up on the board. These are going to be the three main concepts I want you to have in your head. Okay. We're going to be reading about this being a secret project. So I want you to, as we're reading it, think about, all right, why was it secret? What was the purpose of being secret? We're going to talk about where it was at. Okay. Manhattan, some of you said New York, so there might be a tie somewhere to New York, and the question will be why? Why that location? Why not the Aurora project? And why was it the Manhattan project? And I'm going to also want you to focus on, we'll be talking about the speed, why it was such a push to hurry up and get this developed. Okay? Looks like some of those staples came out. You should have a 2-page article, guys. So if the staples came out, make sure you get a different one. Everybody got their copy? All right, so I'm going to be kind of reading it out loud. This is a challenging article. Okay, I'm going to pause several times as we read it to ask you guys some questions, some about the vocabulary, what you think some of the words mean, but then I'll also ask you some questions that I want you to be thinking about. Okay. All right, so please follow along with me. The Manhattan Project, and this, just so you know, this was written in 2012. October 2012 was in the New York Times. Okay, on September 22nd, 1942, in the middle of World War II, the New York Times reported the promotion of 104 members of the armed forces. Few readers likely noticed the name of Colonel Leslie R. Groves of the Corps of Engineers, who was bumped up to Brigadier General, which is a pretty high rank. His new assignment wasn't announced, but the next day he took command of a top-secret mission to transform the principles of theoretical physics into a devastating new weapon that could be delivered by plane against Nazi Germany and Japan. What would later become known as the Manhattan Project would employ nearly 130,000 people at secret sites in New York, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Hanford, Washington, and Los Alamos, New Mexico, where the bombs of the U.S. dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 to end the war with Japan were made. The atomic age ushered in by the Manhattan Project literally changed the world. The race for nuclear supremacy became a driving force in the Cold War, the decades-long confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union after World War II, and raised the specter of nuclear annihilation for the entire world. What do you think the phrase nuclear annihilation? Annihilation is a big word, lots of syllables. What do you think nuclear annihilation? Or just annihilation in general? What do you think annihilation is? Irvin? Destruction. Perfect definition. If we read the dictionary and looked it up, that would probably be one of the words. So destruction, annihilation. Okay. Nuclear weapons put in pretty substantial doubt the long-term survival of civilization, says James G. Hirschberg, a history professor at the George Washington University. I like that quote. Nuclear weapons put in pretty substantial doubt the long-term survival of civilization. Based on what we've read already, just your background knowledge on nuclear weaponry, why do you think nuclear weapons put in pretty substantial doubt the long-term survival of civilization? What do you think they mean by that? Amy?
Because of the nuclear radiation it gives off,
So, expand.
it will get one person has it, and then the more bombs that they use, the more it'll spread,
Okay.
and it'll slowly kill off us.
Right, so if you and I are on opposite ends of the planet, opposite sides of the planet, I send a bomb at you and you send a bomb at me, we're kind of going to eventually that's what the threat here is, that we're just going to kill off the human species, and not just humans, other plants and animals as well. Yes, sir.
They don't know where to store the nuclear, after.
Well, yeah, that we'll get into later. The nuclear annihilation here, you're talking more about nuclear energy, which we'll talk about. But with the nuclear bombs, the like Amy said, the radiation that occurs can be devastating. Okay. All right, the Manhattan Project was rooted in a letter signed by some guy, Albert Einstein. I don't know why they listened to him. And it was sent to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in August 1939, a month before Germany's invasion of Poland set off World War II. Drawing on his famous equation, E equals mc squared, Einstein and other scientists told FDR about research that was currently going on in Europe and at American universities that demonstrated how a chain reaction involving uranium could unleash tremendous power that could be harnessed in extremely powerful bombs. Could be harnessed. What's harnessed mean? What do you think it means in this context? Andrew?
Controlled.
Controlled. Good word for it. Okay. The letter expresses the threat of the Germans succeeding, says Cynthia C. Kelly, president of the Atomic Heritage Foundation. Everyone knew that Hitler, if he had the atomic bomb, would not hesitate to use it on London or Washington. So this time in 1939, when Einstein sent his letter to the president of the United States, his fear was, all right, we got this guy Hitler, he's starting to get a little radical over here in Europe. He hadn't invaded Poland quite yet, so World War II had not officially launched, which again, you guys have not quite hit in history yet, but you probably have heard of Hitler, right? Yeah, you've heard of World War II. So, he was already stirring up some trouble, and it became known to the scientific community that there was a lot of research going on to take this newly discovered energy source and turn it to evil, put it into a bomb that could be devastating. And the fear became elevated that, what happens if Adolf Hitler gets his hands on this technology? The whole World War II results could be completely different. Okay. So Pearl Harbor. How many of you have heard of Pearl Harbor? Okay. You haven't even got to it yet in history, but you guys are brilliant. Okay. As early as 1919, a scientist in Britain had found a way to transform or to change atoms of nitrogen into oxygen. So if you think about what we've been talking about in the periodic table, remember, what did I say the atomic number represented? What was magical about atomic number? What did it tell us about an atom? Marissa?
Oh, about an atom?
Yeah, what does the atomic number tell us?
The proton
Yeah.
and electron.
Right, basically the number of protons, and by default the number of electrons. So what they discovered in 1919, guys, so think about that, that's 100 years ago. Not quite, but almost. They discovered that the ability to take a nitrogen atom, which had 7 protons, and transform it into what they say an oxygen atom, which would have 8. So they figured out a way to pop another proton in there and completely change the element. Okay, so that's what makes it unique. Further research over the next 2 decades revealed that when the atomic nucleus is split, which we call fission, or combined, which we call fusion, it creates a lot of energy and it gets released. Okay, and that's when you talk about nuclear weapons and atomic weapons, it's that fission and fusion that we'll learn about in a little bit later in science. That touches off a chain reaction as the process repeats itself. Scientists thought uranium and the newly discovered element of plutonium were the most likely to produce a reaction, in theory anyways. Why do you think they ended the paragraph, in theory anyways? What would be the author's intent for throwing that clause in at the end? Rashad?
I think it's that they weren't 100% sure.
True, they weren't 100% sure. Why not? Why weren't they 100% sure? Yeah, I mean, this is all new. Remember, we're back in the early 1800s. So they were taking the scientific knowledge that they had at the time and projecting or guessing, making a hypothesis basically on what would happen. So it was kind of theoretical. They hadn't actually put it to practice yet. So Roosevelt, got this letter from Einstein, got a little freaked out, and he heeded his warning and appointed a panel of scientists to pursue atomic research and development. A year and a half later, on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and the U.S. naval base in Hawaii. That brought the U.S. into the war with both Europe and Asia and added urgency to the race for nuclear weapons. The name the Manhattan Project came from the mission's first headquarters in New York City. Manhattan is one of the 5 boroughs of New York. In addition to a strong military presence, New York at that time was home to many scientists who had fled Hitler, and its vast harbor could receive uranium ore and other precious cargo. The project recruited leading physicists. Let's see how many of these names ring a bell to you. Leading physicists, including refugees from fascist Europe like Niels Bohr. We talked about Niels Bohr at all?
No.
Yeah.
Don't you have a Bohr diagram due tomorrow? Okay, we talked about Niels Bohr. Okay. And this gentleman from Denmark, or from Italy, known as Enrico Fermi. Anybody heard of a scientist by the name of Fermi? Anybody ever drive by Fermi Lab up the road?
Yeah.
I live right by them.
I live
Okay.
here too.
So that wonderful science lab we have less than 10 miles from here, is named after Enrico Fermi. And he actually, what's that? Where's it at? I think it's on Kirk Road, just north of here. Okay. Oppenheimer told his colleagues that this mega weapon might prevent future world wars. Supplies of uranium were secured and the secret factories were built to process it. Speed was essential. Scientists were hopeful, but couldn't guarantee that they'd produce a bomb in time to affect the war. Okay, so I'm going to pause there for a second, and I'm going to put my first kind of question up here to you guys, and I want you to read the question silently. I want you to think about it for a second. I want you to look into the text to find evidence. If this was a written response test and you had to explain your answer and give direct evidence like you've been doing in language arts, think about what you would do. Maybe underline a sentence or two that you think would be critical to cite in your response if you were told to quote something from the text. In about 2 minutes, I'm going to have you share your ideas with your neighbor. So we're going to do kind of think, pair, share. I'm going to ask you to think about it, find your ideas, talk about it with your neighbor, see if you guys have similar ideas as to the evidence to support this. And then I'll have some people share their ideas. Okay? So, for your first 2 minutes, just think silently, read it, and try to think about how you would organize your answer. Maybe make little notes in the margin. I'll give you 2 minutes to think. Kind of rescan some of the information, find words that would, like, why do you think it was a secret? Why do you think we kept this from the public? Secrecy. You find evidence that deals specifically was why did we keep this secret? Why do you think? Why didn't we just blast it on the front page of the Chicago Tribune? Some of it was in where up to what I read. We'll probably find some more evidence later on, but there are some things in what I've read. And you might have to do some inferencing here. Think about, interpret the evidence a little bit and say, why do you think that was? Okay, take a couple minutes to talk about it with a neighbor kind of quietly and kind of share why you think and provide at least some evidence. Again, it's not going to be black and white. It doesn't say this is why it was a secret, but use some evidence in there and explain why you think it was.
Yeah.
Gustavo? So, why do you think it was a secret? We'll find out. Rewind, start all over again. Okay, who's willing to share either their thoughts or what they heard from one of their neighbors? Who's willing to share an idea of why was this a secret? And I want you to point, at least give me one quote or something from the evidence. It might not be direct. You might have to infer a little bit, but what's something that led you to that conclusion? Irvin?
My quote was, everyone knew that Hitler, if he had a bomb, he would not hesitate to use it on London or Washington.
Okay.
They use it as a secret because they wouldn't want other countries to find out, or else they would probably use it on the gun.
So what do you think, assuming all this was true, assuming that Hitler was working fast at trying to develop an atomic bomb, if the Chicago Tribune and New York Times and the Herald and everything published, boom, front page, U.S. launches itself into the development of the atomic bomb. So what? Why do we care if Hitler knows?
Because then he might think that, they're probably going to use it against us, so we should be prepared.
So it might speed his process up. Okay, good. So obviously the threat of Germany finding out that we were also looking at this technology, we didn't want them to realize it because it might cause them to ratchet up their research. Okay, Seth?
I said the race for nuclear supremacy became a driving force in the Cold War. And I said that because, it's not really something to make it secret. I'm just saying, if they're trying to make them so fast, they, instead of, trying to take the time to make sure that they're doing it right and just doing it fast, they might mess up and it could hurt people.
True statement. Does that address, you think, why we kept it a secret?
No.
I mean, we're going to talk a little bit later about the speed. That was one of my things I told you to think about. So I'll keep that in the back of your mind. I think that's good. But let's try to focus on the question. If this was a test, that would be a very good answer. But would it address this question?
No.
Probably not. Okay, and that's something you got to constantly think about. Is rereading that question, make sure your evidence supports and addresses that question. Carly, what do you got?
I was just thinking maybe if they found out, they'll brace themselves more and be more prepared for it, rather than catching them off guard.
Okay, sure. Let me rephrase this question a little bit, because I said, why was it a secret? What is some other proof that we've read in that first page and a half that tells you that it was kept secret? Is there anything where it told you remember seeing? Drew?
The vice president didn't really know about it.
Did that say that already, or did you read ahead? I think you read ahead. But maybe it said it. I don't remember reading that. But I know I've read this article numerous times. So you're right. The VP didn't even know. Okay. And right in the front page, remember when we talked about how that general was promoted to brigadier general and then put in charge of this project? It was kind of kept hush-hush. So obviously this was a secret. Okay. All right, let's continue on. So we left off after supplies of uranium paragraph. So we're on the last paragraph on page 19 of the article. So when we ended it, we talked about, I was reading that speed was becoming the critical thing. They were really pushing hard at trying to get this developed, because they wanted to be able to use it against Hitler if they needed to. Okay. As it turned out, as Richard Rhodes wrote in The Making of the Atomic Bomb, the U.S. was racing against an imaginary clock. Lacking America's industrial might and critical mass of scientific talent, Germany's nuclear research had faltered. Japan was even further behind. The only country close to keeping pace surreptitiously was the Soviet Union, a U.S. ally against Germany during World War II. All right, vocab word, surreptitiously. How many of you use that in your daily vocab? I don't. Okay, what do you think it means based on that? It says, so we just talked about how Germany and Japan weren't even close to being up to speed on the technology needed and the education needed to build the bomb. And it says the only country close to keeping pace with us surreptitiously was the Soviet Union. What do you think that means?
Like kind of like close to us, a little more ahead, but close, not like over dramatic or engaging.
Not quite. And this is a tough word. Joshua?
Temporary, like they were ahead temporarily.
Good guess too. Actually, what that means is kind of like secretly. You know? So, it unbeknownst to us, the Soviet Union, or what was the USSR at the time, was also kind of the second in line as far as knowledge on this subject. So that kind of surprised us. We had no idea that they were that far along. Okay. Let me see. Before we start reading about Fat Man and Little Boy, another question I want you to kind of scan the evidence for. We've already definitely read this. It's called the Manhattan Project. Okay. Why? Find some evidence in the article. Another think, pair, share. Take 2 minutes to find some evidence. Why New York? Why not Aurora? Why not Chicago? Why not Los Angeles? What made Manhattan or New York City special to have this secret project going on? So underline, highlight a sentence or two you think would be good direct evidence to use in your response. 2 minutes to think about it, 2 minutes to share. Build your own atomic bomb here and kind of take a look at prep parts. It's going to lead to like ink getting all over your hands. I put it back. Looks like a lot of you have highlighted or underlined a very similar passage. So take a minute or two and share your evidence as to why New York with your neighbor.
Yeah, I was like saying missions to New York and Manhattan is one of the five.
I think we kind of all have the same.
Yeah. Yawns are yeah.
When I young,
What did you think, Gustavo?
well, they water.
If you reread that paragraph, why do you think they picked New York?
Depends on my yawns.
See if you can answer the
We
question.
do.
Just focus on that. Tell me if you can find a sentence or two in there that
That would
jumps off.
I-
Okay, Donovan Garcia.
No.
What was your evidence that you highlighted, underlined, or heard your neighbor say that you agree with as to why Manhattan, why not Aurora?
The name Manhattan Project came from the mission's first headquarters in New York City.
Yeah, it did, but why? Why New York? Why did they pick that? What was the reason that they picked Manhattan? Gustavo?
It had a strong military presence and its vast harbor could receive uranium more than other cargo.
Right, and I'm not going to pull down the U.S. map here, but if you think about where New York is, right on the coast, okay? So think about everything you've learned in history up till now, the colony days. I mean, think about where big cities have developed. When you have access to the waterway, so ships can come in and unload cargo, that's a good thing to have if you want to be in an industrial area, okay? New York City also had a lot of the leading scientists at the time. Okay? They were able to bring in that plutonium, the cargo, pretty easily right into New York Harbor. And so that was probably the best evidence was in that paragraph on page 19. So they had the scientists, they had the military presence, and they had easy access to cargo. Did anybody find any other references that you think were also good that we, if you were writing this up and you might also cite? Or was that what most people found?
That's what I.
Was that what you found? Thank you. All right. Fat Man and Little Boy. What do you think that's going to be about? Is that going to be about a sumo wrestler and a kindergartner? Amy. Amy thinks it's going to be about one roll of fat bomb and one roll of small bomb. So let's see. Fat Man and Little Boy. The project continued in secret as the war began to turn in the Allies' favor. President Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945. So you're going to learn that he died before the end of World War II. And the fate of this still untested bomb now rested with his successor, Harry S. Truman. Incredibly, Roosevelt had kept Truman in the dark about the Manhattan Project during his brief time as FDR's vice president. So as Drew said earlier, I think he might have read ahead a little bit because I don't think I read it yet.
I didn't know
Or he just knew it because he also knew a little bit about the atomic bomb, the Manhattan Project. So think about that. Think about Obama working on such a top secret thing that he didn't even let the vice president know what was going on. That's how secretive this was. There were very few people that had a clue that we were trying to develop this bomb that could lead to nuclear annihilation and destruction. Okay? So July 16, 1945, 3 months after Truman became president, the world's first atomic bomb was tested in New Mexico's desert. As I lay there in the final seconds, General Groves later wrote, I thought only of what I would do if the countdown got to 0 and nothing happened. So again, we talked about how this was theory. That one paragraph they ended with, in theory anyways. They thought that this chain reaction of plutonium and uranium would result in lots of energy release. But they didn't know until they actually officially tested it. So this was the first testing. So think about it. If you spent all this time and money and all your efforts were put into something and you push the button and nothing happened, you'd be like, oh, man, think how embarrassing, how exhausting that would be, draining of you emotionally. But that didn't happen. Something did happen. Just before dawn, a giant fireball exploded with a force of 20,000 tons of dynamite. A cloud of desert dust and gaseous iron soared into the atmosphere, forming the mushroom-shaped cloud that would become the terrifying symbol of the atomic age. So I'm guessing you've all seen movies with, pretend nuclear explosions where you got that mushroom cloud. Okay. The atomic bomb test in New Mexico was nicknamed Fat Man, after a character in the Humphrey Bogart movie, The Maltese Falcon. It was 10 feet long and 5 feet in diameter. So that image I showed you at the start of class, that's Fat Man. Okay? So it was, if this was in real size, it would be 10 feet long, so the height of the ground to a basketball rim for you basketball players, and about 5 feet in diameter. Okay, so think about one of your heights, 5 foot. I mean, that would be the diameter of this bomb. So it was a pretty big thing, and it weighed 10,000 pounds. Then they had a second one they tested called Little Boy. Now, if you look at that, it was still 10 feet long, but it was 28 inches in diameter. So it was much narrower. Instead of 5 feet, it was only a couple feet in diameter, but it still weighed 9,700 pounds. So, mass-wise, density-wise, it was probably more compacted because it had about the same weight. With Germany having already surrendered in the spring, Truman faced a momentous decision about the war in Asia. Momentous. Vocab word. What do you think that means? Kaylee?
A big decision?
Big decision. Yeah, this could be like life-changing. Okay? You don't have a momentous decision about what you're gonna have for breakfast. Okay? Do I have the Pop-Tart or do I have the Cheerios? That you might struggle over that, but it's not momentous. It's not life-changing. Okay. So his decision was whether to risk an invasion of Japan that was expected to result in the loss of hundreds of thousands of Americans, or to shorten the war by dropping the atomic bomb on them. Okay? Truman decided to use the bomb. On August 6, 1945, a converted American B-29 bomber called the Enola Gay, so you'll remember that when you get to history, so it was the plane that carried the Little Boy bomb over Hiroshima. So Little Boy was the one that was dropped on Hiroshima, or Hiroshima, depending on how you pronounce it. Buildings within a quarter mile were vaporized, so completely gone. Okay? An estimated 70,000 people were killed instantly. 3 days later, after an American warning, But with no sign of the Japanese surrendering, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, killing another 40,000 people immediately. So those two bombs resulted in over 100,000 deaths. Boom. Not even considering the longer-term effect of radiation and what other things would have potentially happened, but instant death to 100,000 people. Tens of thousands more were injured, and countless survivors would later suffer the effects of radiation like cancer or birth defects. 6 days later, on August 15th, Japan surrendered. Within 2 years, the Manhattan Project would be replaced by a civil-controlled Atomic Energy Commission. But atomic weaponry would figure in American military policy for decades to come. Though the U.S. knew its nuclear monopoly would not last, Washington was nonetheless stunned when on September 23, 1949, President Truman announced that the Soviet Union had successfully tested an atomic bomb. So 3 or 4 years later, again, we use that word surreptitiously, we had no clue that the Soviet Union was even close to this technology. And 3 or 4 years afterwards, they had their own atomic bomb. We then found out that Americans subsequently learned that it was built largely with secrets passed to the Soviets by a British physicist and an American scientist, and a U.S. Army engineer named David Greenglass. Okay, if you read a little footnote, this is kind of interesting, a little asterisk that says, Greenglass was arrested in 1950 and then later testified against his sister and brother-in-law, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, dooming them to the electric chair. So depending on where you go in your high school history classes or beyond, you might hear about the Rosenbergs. Okay? They were these civilians who got some, who allegedly, or I guess it was proven in court, helped pass on these secrets to the Soviet Union. So that's kind of like treason, giving away some of our secrets. So they were sentenced to death. So they died in the electric chair. And up until the day the minute they flipped the switch, they claimed they had nothing to do with it. They were innocent. So who knows? MAD, mutually assured destruction. What do you think? What is that heading? From what we've read, we're talking about nuclear annihilation. What do you think mutually assured destruction might mean as we continue reading through this? What do you think, Maitran? Mutually assured destruction. Any clue based on the context of what we've been reading? What's mutually mean? Maybe. They have any clues? Mutually? Same. Okay. So basically everybody can mutually assured destruction. So what does that say?
Everyone knows it'll lead to destruction.
Everybody does, and if it means mutually, it means that. Think back to, we talked about nuclear annihilation. So Jordan, you're the head of the Soviet Union, and we're beginning the Cold War, and you have your thumb on the button. I'm the President of the United States, I got my thumb on the button. You twitch, you hit your bomb, and all of a sudden that missile starts coming at me. What do you think I'm going to do? I'm going to hit my button, send a missile to you, right? So what they talked about was this policy of mutually assured destruction. If I have a nuclear bomb and you have a nuclear bomb, basically all it's saying is that, all right, if one of us gets a little trigger itchy and pushes a button, we've just basically agree to kill each other. Because if I send the bomb to you, you're not going to say, oh, if I send this, millions of people are going to die in the United States. You're going to retaliate and boom, hit your button. All right, so mutually assured destruction. The Soviet tested off a nuclear arms race. Touched off a nuclear arms race. With the development of the intercontinental ballistic missile in the 1950s, so this was the first missile that could actually travel from continent to continent. Okay, the ones that we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were dropped from a plane. Okay. Any place on Earth was vulnerable to annihilation. So the superpowers also pursued expensive defensive strategies and finally settled in effect on a policy of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. Okay. I believe that we are going to be out of time in 5 minutes, so we probably won't finish this later. Actually, I'll finish the article, but I'm going to give you a worksheet to have you guys work on it as homework, because I know you guys love homework. Okay.
No.
All right.
Yay!
Soviets installed missiles in Cuba, provoking a 13-day crisis. Probably the closest the world has ever come to a nuclear conflict. So this is back in the 1960s, and you'll learn about the Cuban Missile Crisis in history as well. Treaties between the U.S. and Soviet Union to reduce the number of weapons and curb their spread to other countries were made beginning in the 1960s. But today, at least 9 countries, and by today, this is 2012, at least 9 countries are believed to have nuclear weapons. And there's a chart on the previous page. So if we flip back, we have nuclear weapons: Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, Great Britain, France, China, Israel, India, Pakistan, and North Korea. Though U.S. and Russian stockpiles have shrunk, the Manhattan Project's legacy, according to the Federation of American Scientists, includes more than 19,000 nuclear weapons worldwide today. And the threat that Iran is developing a nuclear weapon capable of hitting Israel and much of Europe, or that terrorists may get a hold of nuclear weapons, is making headlines in 2012 and continued in 2013. Weapon research also led to peaceful applications for nuclear technology, like nuclear power generation and medical diagnostics and treatments. But questions about the safety of nuclear power plants and the long-term effect of radiation exposed fueled an international no nukes movement beginning in the 1970s. Had he lived, Einstein might have joined in. A decade after he helped usher in the nuclear age, Einstein, a pacifist, which is somebody that's kind of against war, said he regretted his letter to Roosevelt, calling it the one great mistake in my life. Though he added that there was some justification, the danger that the Germans would make nuclear weapons. So why do you think Einstein thought that writing that letter to FDR was his biggest regret, biggest mistake? Irvin?
So many people died when he came up with the theory of E equals MC squared.
It wasn't necessarily a theory, but he helped develop the atomic bomb. So think if you developed the technology, but you were not a person that believed in killing, and that's what a pacifist is. You know, he doesn't believe that war is good and there should be a peaceful resolution to conflicts. But your brain power leads to the technology of this bomb, and then you see it dropped, and 70,000 people vaporized with the first bomb, and another 40,000 later on. Think about how traumatic that could be to you as a person. Okay? So he did say that, that was probably his biggest regret in life. In New York, one of the few visible reminders of the Manhattan Project's legacy is a statue on Riverside Drive of a 13th century Buddhist monk that survived the bombing of Hiroshima. A plaque on the bomb describes it as a testimonial to the atomic bomb devastation and a symbol of lasting hope for world peace. So it's kind of ironic, if you think about Buddha, Buddhism. Buddhism are pacifists as well. It's a belief of solving conflicts peacefully. So if you think about the Buddhist symbols that you probably have seen, that Buddhist symbol, that statue somehow survived the bomb. So now it is in New York City. All right, so I'm going to pass out a handout that has 4 questions, 2 or 3 that we've already discussed. Your homework. Keep the article because you want to provide direct evidence, and then we'll talk about your responses tomorrow. Take one, pass it down. Now I expect when you guys get to history and you get to the World War II unit, you completely blow away your history teachers because you can talk about, hey, yeah, we know the Enola Gay and Fat Man, and Little Boy, and the Manhattan Project. Interest? Did you guys all get them?
I actually only knew it because there are two
Okay, in our closing. This is one I want you to think about. We can just kind of talk out loud about this one quickly. This is one of your questions. It says, in the article it states that supplies of uranium were secured and secret factories were built to process it. Speed was essential. Why did they think that speed was important, and was it really important? So do you remember from our reading, what was the reason they were working so fast? We kind of discussed this first.
Because they wanted to be the fastest people to actually make a bomb.
Yeah, they were trying to beat Hitler, right?
Yeah.
But was speed really important? Did they need to be working as urgently as they thought?
No.
Why not?
Because Germany never came up with them.
Yeah, because like Andrew said, the people that we were concerned about, Japan and Germany at the time, weren't even close to having the technology. We thought they were. So we were busting our butts to beat them to it. And that's when we found out surreptitiously that it was actually the Soviet Union that we were closest. Okay? All right, so work on those. We'll talk about tomorrow. Good job, guys. Slide in your chairs.